Thank you all for joining us for the Receiving and Giving Feedback in Graduate School workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Rebecca Rice, Assistant Professor in Communication Studies. She's going to discuss how to collaborate, mentor, and find common ground in graduate school teaching and research. So I'm going to go ahead and just hand it over to Dr. Rice to get us started. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. Happy Friday, happy Taylor Swift album and Carly Rae Jepsen album release day. This is a historic day for pop music, so I hope that you've been listening to good music. So today I want to talk about, yes, I love the clapping. I want to talk about receiving and giving feedback in graduate school, which I'm excited to talk about because feedback is really interesting and really important and continues to be important, especially if you pursue a research career. So we get feedback all the time as academics starting in grad school. And that doesn't always mean that it's easy to know what to do with it or to manage the emotions that go with it. So that's kind of what we're going to start with covering today. So first I want to just talk about why feedback feels different in graduate school than it might have ever felt before. And then we'll talk more specifically about advisors who might give you a lot of feedback in graduate school, how to process feedback productively, and then giving feedback as well. So you might be in a TA or RA role as a graduate student where you're giving feedback, and you might also have to give feedback to your peers. So how do we give feedback in a way that is productive? So feedback in grad school, I don't know about you all, but like the first time I saw a paper that someone had edited for me in graduate school, it was a professor that I will never forget because he gave me back my 10-page paper with maybe 200 track changes on it in Microsoft Word. Like, you know how in Microsoft Word it changes the color of text when the text has been changed? There was no black text left on the screen by the time he was done with the document. And you have that moment of like, ugh, right? Like, what am I supposed to do with this? I'm a failure. Look at this document right now. And that's just something that happens, right? At some point, you're going to encounter someone who gives you a lot of feedback if it hasn't happened yet. Knowing what to do with it can be difficult. On one level, this is because you are trying to achieve a higher level of education than you ever have before. So to do that, you have to gain new skills at every level, right? So at the bachelor's level, you might have gotten less feedback from professors. You might have been meeting requirements at a higher level. So if you were meeting those requirements, there might not have been a lot that people were saying to you. You know, if I gave graduate school level feedback to the junior class that I'm teaching right now, I think they would be like, this is unfair, right? You can't expect me to know all of these things. So to get to the next level of knowing more things, there's going to be more feedback, but that doesn't make the transition easier. And it's not always something I think we think about when we opt to go to grad school, right? We often opt to go to grad school because it's like, oh, I love school, so I'm going to keep doing it. But there can be these moments then where you're like, wait, if I love school, why doesn't it feel like school is loving me back right now? So our goal is to get past that moment where we're thinking that feedback and a lot of feedback means that we did a bad job. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The other thing that happens in graduate school, I think, or it happened to me, was that I started to tie my work in graduate school to my sense of self and my identity. I research organizational communication. And this is totally a normal process where our jobs are part of how we know who we are. So when you start to do a job and the longer you do that job, the more you're likely to determine like who you are and how well you're doing in life based on how you're doing in that job. So there are strategies for kind of creating space for ourselves where we don't think our jobs are our lives, right? But in graduate school, it might start to feel like school is your job now. And maybe that wasn't true during your bachelor's. So I think there's that moment where you start to identify as a graduate student, right? I'm a grad student. It becomes a thing that you say a lot. And that means that you're going to start to tie your work and your productivity to who you are and how well you're doing graduate student. And that's a normal process, but that can make it feel really personal when you get feedback, right? Because now the feedback feels like it's about you. And this is also true because a lot of our product is writing. So people are critiquing your words that you put on paper versus if I was doing something at a job, the outcome might be team related, right? It might be a bunch of people contributed to something. So it might feel like I own less of the product than in graduate school where your writing in particular is being critiqued. So the person who is likely to give you the most advice in graduate school is your advisor. Um, and it might not be right away, right? You might receive a lot of feedback in courses at first, but then as you start to work with an advisor more closely on a professional project or a thesis or some other outcome, you might get a lot of feedback from that person. So understanding what your advisor is thinking when they give you feedback is really helpful. And I think that we often don't mean to do this, but like, so now I advise, right? But before this, not too long ago, I had an advisor. It's it's a lot of mind reading, right? You get the document back and you're like, do they hate me? Do they hate what I sent them? And we don't always do a good job of explaining why we're giving feedback or what the feedback is for. And then people also have very different feedback styles. So one suggestion that I have for you is that you ask your advisor, what is your philosophy around feedback and editing? What do you want me to have done before I turn a paper in versus what is kind of your style of giving feedback? For example, in my PhD, my advisor, it took like 2 years. He finally told me, he said, I'm not really a grammar editor and I'm tired of spending time editing your grammar. So if you could find a way to make that go better, then I would be able to focus more on substantive issues. So I downloaded Grammarly actually, which is a free editing app, and I used that. And that was a good compromise because then my papers looked less terrifying when I got them back because he didn't have to fix all the grammar stuff, but also it gave him more energy to focus on the substance stuff. So just having more clear conversations with advisors can be really helpful. And advisors don't always know to have that conversation with you, right? So it could be a good question to ask someone or to ask multiple people as you're trying to figure out who you would like to work with. So there are three kind of, I don't think these are the only forms of advisor feedback I've ever seen, but I think there are three things that can be difficult to work with from advisors or that might make some work for you on your part to figure out what your advisor is thinking. The first one is blunt feedback. My master's advisor, very, very kind person. When you met with her in person, I don't think she ever said something nice on a draft of my thesis. Like, there was no moment where she was like, good job, Rebecca, you wrote a draft. I remember one time she said to me, this is a good start. Emphasis on start. And that was probably the kindest feedback she ever gave me. And it took me a while as I was learning to work with her to understand that she didn't mean that in a mean way. It's just that for her, feedback was about making improvements to a manuscript. And so she didn't really think as much about how there might be feelings involved on my side or how I might need someone to kind of comfort me as I was receiving this feedback. So that's okay if you have an advisor who gives really blunt feedback. It's just good to know that. Like, this person is not being mean to me right now in this document. They're just focused on things that they're trying to improve. And I might have to find praise from other sources, right? So I might have to have a peer reader who can read my work and tell me what they like about it. Or I might have to find some sort of support on campus where I am generating like happy vibes to go along with this kind of blunt feedback. So having a network of people who support you is really helpful because then the messages you're receiving aren't only coming from one person. The second thing is limited feedback. Totally had a professor in my graduate career who put a bunch of comments on like the first 2 pages of documents, and then you would flip through the next 10 pages and there was nothing on them. And then at the end, he would write something. And that can be scary because you're like, wait, is it good or not? Like, did you engage with it on the level that I might have expected you to? So you might get kind of limited feedback from someone. In that case, I suggest asking them or talking to them about what kind of feedback would be helpful to you. So if you can tell them what your concerns are when you send them a document, I think that helps people to say, hey, I'm wondering if the structure of chapter 2 of this thesis make sense to you? Is the organization okay? That might direct their limited feedback toward the thing that you really need help with. The other thing is some people are just not big annotators, right? So you might get more feedback verbally from that person. So being prepared to hear feedback in different ways can be helpful. One thing you could do, for example, I have had professors in my life who give wonderful feedback in conversation and a lot of it, and there's no way I can write it all down, right? So in that case, I really wish at the time I had thought, but now I see students do this, to ask, is it okay if I record this so that I have accurate notes of what your feedback are? Tell them if you're going to do it, right? But if there's someone who's better at giving feedback conversationally, that's something that you could consider doing to get more feedback from them. Again, back to the idea of a network of people who give feedback. This is also a case where you might want someone who can give you different feedback about your project. So peer reviewers can be really useful, swapping with other people in your cohorts, going to the writing center so that you're getting feedback from other sources. And then the third thing that you might have happen is you might have someone who really doesn't want to hurt your feelings and doesn't want to give you feedback that might be hard to hear, so they just don't. And that can be difficult in its own ways, especially if they're not telling you things that might need to be fixed, and then you go to something like a thesis defense, and other committee members are pointing out things that are brand new to you, right? So if you feel that you're encountering that, you might want to say to that person, I'm nervous about, how other faculty might think about this. So could you read this document and kind of give me like a bit of a harsher edit of it. I would do that before I sent things to journals or out to conferences. I would go to professors who I'd written those seminar papers for, and I would say, can you read this as if you were a paper reviewer? And that told them that I was like ready for it, right? I was like, I need your help, and I would rather hear it from you than hear it from a stranger. So if you could help me to give kind of honest feedback about what a reviewer might think, that would be helpful. So those are some of my suggestions for ways that you can talk with advisors and ways that you can ask them for, advising is a relationship between two people. So it's about what you need and what your advisor needs. It's also about context, right? You have a history of receiving feedback from a variety of people. Your advisor might have a context that they're coming from. I know that the write-up talked a little bit about like generational differences, right? But that can be something that's playing into how the feedback is being read. So I just suggest it's always better to talk about it. If you're nervous about talking about it, practice talking about it with a friend first to make sure, does this sound okay that I'm going to say this like this? But conversations about advising styles just pay off for so long after you have them because you have a better understanding of what your advisor is looking at and what they might be thinking. So let's get to the good part. The good part is where you're me and you get the 200 track changes on the Word document, right? No, I'm just kidding. That moment is horrifying. So what do we do with feedback, right? How do we process feedback? I recommend a couple things, and I actually asked Twitter, academic Twitter, I was like, how do you all process feedback? What would you recommend to students? The first thing that almost everyone has said to me is if feedback on a paper is freaking you out, put it away for 24 hours. Like read it and then put it in a drawer, go for a walk, go watch a movie, because the initial reaction you have might not be telling you the truth about how bad or good the feedback is. So take 24 hours after you read it for the first time. Then someone told me, and I'm going to start doing this with journal reviews, that she takes the feedback and she highlights everything that's positive in the feedback. And by highlighting it, she can start to see that there's actually more positive going on than she might have expected in a paper. So if you get like a big chunk of text from someone of here's what I liked and didn't like, if you can go through and highlight, it's really important to find ways to like keep positive vibes in your life. The other thing I have is called a kudos file. It's in my email, and I just have a label that says kudos. My friend in corporate America told me to do it. If anyone emails me anything remotely nice about myself or my work, it goes in the kudos file. Because there are days when you're like, should I be in grad school? Should I be an academic? And then you have to go back through the file and be like, oh, this student really liked that day I said that in class, or this person liked this paper I wrote. So we need to shore ourselves up with optimism in academia. We get a lot of feedback, so finding ways to highlight the good is really helpful. The next thing I recommend is that you break criticism into steps about how to change papers or projects in ways that are helpful. So as part of that process, you might realize you don't know exactly what to do with feedback that you were given. And it's good to kind of sort through, if I break down every piece of feedback into what I should do to the paper, what do I not understand? And that's a moment to go talk to your advisor, right? You don't want to go in and say, you made 60 recommendations to me and I don't know what to do with any of them. It's good to just take a step, right, and say, okay, I can make an attempt at revising this. But if there are a couple things that you're stuck on, in my experience, that's when you get into a spiral of avoiding each other. I don't know if anyone's experienced this, but sometimes if you owe someone revisions on something and you don't know how to do them, it's easy to be like, I'm just going to not look at them or return their emails, and hopefully they won't notice. And that's bad because that delays things like graduation and defending projects. So by making yourself say, here's the feedback, here's what I'm going to do about it, you can notice when there's a breakdown in understanding what revisions to make, and that can help you to ask follow-up questions. And I'll show you how I do that in just a second. But a couple more things. Next, I absolutely keep a list of ideas for rejection rewards. So this started when I started submitting studies to journals, and getting a rejection from a journal can just be really hurtful, right? It's a lot of work or from a conference, and getting a rejection can just be like, no, my hope in this paper is lost. So I started giving myself some sort of reward for submitting in the first place. The reward if the thing gets into the conference is that I get to go to the conference. But the reward if the thing gets rejected is usually that I get ice cream. That's like my standing agreement with my husband. But if the project is really big and I'm taking like a bigger risk sending it somewhere, I'll pick something that is like a really good reward. So for me, that's clothes. So I'll like pick out a good pair of shoes I want and I'll go get that. My friend said that hers is going to Whole Foods and buying whatever she wants. Just as like a silly fancy thing to do, right? So something that makes you feel like, well, at least I tried, and now I get a little bit of dopamine because I picked my reward, to reinforce that it's good to put yourself out there. It's good to submit to conferences and journals. And if you're not getting rejected because you're not trying, that's no better than not trying at all, right? So you might as well send things out. And then take breaks while revising. This goes to creating actionable steps. If you say, I'm going to do all this feedback on my thesis, chapter 3, in the next 6 hours, that's just a lot of energy and it's really draining. So I try to make myself stop revising after 30 minutes, get up, go for a walk, and then do no more than like 2 hours of revisions in a day because it's just a lot to process. So to show you how I break feedback into actionable steps, I'm going to show you the most terrifying set of revisions I've been given recently. So this is from a journal that I submitted to in like May, I think, and in August they sent me a revise and resubmit, which is when you get to make revisions to send something back to an academic journal. So that's an exciting moment. And then you read the email and you see how many pages of text they sent you about what you need to revise. And that's the moment. So this isn't even everything they told me to revise. I think there were 2 more screenshots I couldn't fit on the page. But at first, terrifying, right? What am I going to do with all this feedback? So what I do is I make an Excel sheet and I take every single thing that they said to do and I break it down into exactly one revision. Because like this top thing that you can see, one framing, that is a lot of suggestions that this person is saying to me in one paragraph. And if I just look at that paragraph over and over, it's not clear to me what to do. So this is an example of what I do. I make a spreadsheet. The left-hand column is which reviewer it is, just to keep track. The next column over is what they said to do, broken down into exactly one thing they said to do. The next column is any questions I have about what to do or like brainstorming about what to do. Maybe I need to read more about this. I'm not really sure what they mean by doing this. writing through that confusion actually often solves my problem. If I say, I don't know what to do with this thing, I think one thing I could do is this, suddenly I have an idea, right? And I haven't had to like commit to deleting a paragraph yet or anything. So I do that, and then for revise and resubmits, this is probably a topic for a workshop some other day. You send in a giant letter called your reviewer letter where you tell them exactly what you did to process their feedback. So I write the revision letter in the Excel sheet so that I can say, you told me to do this. I did that on page 5 by doing the following, so that when it comes time to write the letter, I have every single step that I made. So you probably don't have to do this for papers in graduate school, but I really recommend the Excel sheet format if you have that moment of like, I don't know what to do, or even just a little to-do list. Like I have a little bullet journal I keep, and I'll just write down every single step. Because if I write on my to-do list, revise thesis, that's way too big, right? I'm not going to revise my thesis in one day. But if I say, edit intro to include this, add this source, fix the grammar on paragraph 2, suddenly I can start checking boxes off. So it feels more manageable to deal with the feedback you've been given. So, what about giving feedback? I think you're all in a really good spot to give good feedback because as grad students, you receive a lot of feedback. So you know what it feels like and you know how to approach it in a way that's helpful and empathetic. Um, at the same time, sometimes you get really mean feedback, right? And I think we, unfortunately, not grad students, but professors, have kind of this cycle that happens in academia where someone tore us down at one point, so we feel like we should go be really harsh judges of the next paper we have to review. And I really want us to stop doing that. I really want us to feel like the person on the receiving end and not the person who suddenly has the power to give feedback that freaks someone out. So I always think, first of all, of starting with your own intentions as you read a paper. Are you reading it? Or are you reading student work? Or are you hearing someone in your cohort's ideas? And are you sort of having that moment of, ooh, I am ready to critique this thing, right? And I think we kind of train each other, unfortunately, for that moment to be kind of exciting. We go into debate mode. But if you instead take a step back and say, how can I be someone who improves or helps the person I'm about to give feedback to, instead of someone who's about to critique or tell them what they didn't do? That makes you give more sophisticated feedback, and actually you often learn things from forming opinions about that as well. So that's my first suggestion. My second suggestion, this is probably more for folks who are teaching right now, but prioritize feedback that's the most important. In student work in particular, I try to think through like what are my top 3 to 5 suggestions for someone's paper. And that's not to say that there isn't more that they could improve, but if a student wants more to do, they'll often come tell me, right? Otherwise, if people open something and you give them 20 things to do, and like one of them is a very small grammar change, and one of them's a huge thing that would make the paper so much better, it's hard for them to sort through all of that, right? So at the very least, put the important stuff at the top. But I also think that sometimes we give each other so much feedback to prove, like, I could find as many problems as possible in this paper. And just saying, okay, what's the number one thing that I could say that would help them to move this project forward tends to help me slow my roll and give them the most important feedback first. And then, of course, think about the feedback that has helped you the most. I can certainly think of the things people said to me in graduate school that completely changed how I was thinking about something. I will say, not all of that feedback felt particularly nice at the time. I had someone tell me in graduate school, and I probably owe this person a lot, that I am like a pretty fun, joking person, and that I was studying something really serious. I was studying natural disasters. And he said, I want you to learn how to deliver presentations about your topic in a way that is as serious as the topic is. And I was like, ouch, I'm hilarious, sir. But I get it, right? He was saying, like, maybe that's not the time for you to do your stand-up routine at the conference. Like, maybe this is a moment where you're doing something important and you can take it seriously and you can get other people to do the same thing. I don't think that feedback was particularly easy to give for that person, right? That's a moment where if you give feedback to someone, there's always a risk that they tell you like you're being rude, right? But he invested enough in me to say that to me at the time. So that's kind of the last thing I want to leave you with before we open this to discussion is that the best thing someone said to me in graduate school is that feedback is an investment. No one owes you feedback, and if they're giving you feedback, they are giving you something that can propel you forward. If they just hated it and they didn't want to help you, they wouldn't say anything, right? So if someone's giving you feedback, even if it feels like, whoa, that hurts a little bit, I always try to think, how did that person just invest in helping me get this project forward? And even if there's someone who hates the project, that helps me prepare for the next time someone hates the project. So I might as well use it and put it in the spreadsheet. So that's most of what I have to say. I would love to hear if you all have other questions or comments. I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen though, so I'm gonna, oh, I can. I just had to click on it. All right, yes. So if we have questions, if anyone would like to unmute or type them in the chat or any other advice you have, I would love for us to crowdsource.
Thank you so much for the great presentation. Please feel free to unmute yourselves, or you can either type it in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with, either speaking on your own experiences, or if you want to add anything or ask any questions, now would be the time. While our audience thinks, I have a question. Do you have any tips for giving challenging feedback to a mentee in person, or whether it's in person or video chat, kind of more of a face-to-face format?
Yeah, I think that explicitly stating your intentions is really helpful in that moment. So telling someone like, you know, what I have some feedback for you about this thing, and the reason I'm giving it to you is fill in the blank. I think that can be a really helpful way to make the person understand why you're going to give them the feedback that you're about to give them. I also think that it's okay to like not give someone all the difficult feedback at once, you know, or to take breaks or to say at a certain point, like I think with face to face, we expect people to react right away, right? But that can be really hard for people. So if you're giving someone difficult feedback, it's okay to say, I know this might be a lot to process right now. How about you think about it and think about what steps you might take with it, and then we meet again a week from now or something like that. So I think that either of those can be helpful. And then I really just do think about the time that guy told me not to make jokes about natural disasters, right? Because it probably was hard for him to say that to me, but it's feedback that's more valuable than any time someone told me good job. So you can help people in a way that's real as long as you approach it from a place of empathy and you are telling them like why you're telling them what you're telling them. I think it can be really helpful.
Thank you. So it looks like we have a question in the chat. What are some mistakes that first-time mentors make that I can prevent myself from making in the future? So this might be maybe for our teaching GAs that maybe are aspiring to go into academia or things like that.
Yeah, I think it depends on you and what you already know to be true about yourself. Um, I'm very conflict averse, like in life. So I do have a hard time giving people difficult feedback, and it has taken me a lot of time. And frankly, like I have to practice. Like I will tell either a colleague or my husband, like, hey, I think I have to have a conversation with someone about this. Can I just run through how I would like to do it? And then I'll write it out. And I think that that prepares you to have the conversation that you might need to have. Um, Otherwise, I feel like early in my teaching career, I often was just not clear enough about like what needed to happen if I was giving someone difficult feedback. So don't be afraid to follow up anything, any conversation with an email. Like even if it's as simple as I used to tell students, you know, they would come up to me after class and they'd be like, "Hey, I didn't turn that paper in. Can I turn it in this week?" And I would say, yeah, turn it in by tomorrow. And then they would leave, and there would be no proof that I told them they had to turn it in by tomorrow. There was no proof about what time that was tomorrow. There was no conversation about what the consequences were if they didn't turn it in tomorrow. So now I try to follow up and just say, hey, I know we talked after class about you having difficulties turning this in. I'm going to finish grading by tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. If the paper's in before then, there will be no late deduction. After that, I would have to take late deduction of 25%. Just like getting things in writing has saved me so much back and forth of, you didn't tell me I had to do that. So it can be a kind thing to do for someone, right? Because we also forget what people say to us. So don't be afraid to send follow-up emails is, I guess, one piece of advice I would have.
Thank you. We have another question. How do you initiate a conversation with an advisor about their philosophy around feedback and editing? Is it better to approach them in person or start the conversation through email?
I think it depends on how long you have been working with them or what stage of the project you're in. If you're just starting working with an advisor, I think, there's usually kind of a getting to know you meeting that happens with an advisor, and that would be a good place to say, oh, yeah, so one question I have is like, you might start with yourself, right? Like, here's how I often receive feedback or what tends to work for me. Can you tell me about your feedback style so that I can be prepared for that as I send you drafts of things? Um, I think you could certainly put it in an email. Like if you're going to meet with someone, you can say, hey, I would like to talk with you about, starting to write chapter one. And also, I would love to have a conversation about how to best use your feedback on papers so that they have a bit of a heads up about what you would like to talk about and it's not coming out of nowhere. Now you've also been to a workshop on feedback. So the next time you and your advisor are chatting, you could be like, oh, we had this conversation about giving and receiving feedback. And one thing they asked us to do was think about our own style of giving feedback. Could you tell me what you think yours is? So it could be a bit of a more conversational thing.
I think that's great advice because sometimes the kind of talking about the philosophy of feedback, we as the receivers might think that the feedback is really mean, but the advisor doesn't think that. So I think it's important to maybe have that conversation just to get on the same page. Um, just regardless of the generations or sometimes it's just different styles that we interpret it a specific way, but they are not intending to give it that way. So I think it's important to have the conversations. Um, I had another question here in the chat. Somebody asked, how can I ease tension or mend my mentees' hurt feelings if they take my feedback poorly?
Ooh, um, I mean, it's hard because do you want to just say to them, hey, it seems like maybe um, that conversation we had the other day was difficult for you. Would you like to revisit it? That's a hard thing to say in any relationship, I think. But the thing about being a mentor and mentee is that you might have to go there. In your friendships, you might not have a real conversation like that where you're like, hey, it seems like I said this thing at brunch that infuriated you. But if you're being someone's mentor, another thing that you're modeling is like healthy conflict resolution and healthy relationship maintenance. So I think that you can kind of frame it that way, perhaps, and say, hey, it seems like maybe after I gave you this feedback, we haven't been having as easy of conversations. And if they then, okay, I will say one problem I've had is that sometimes if I say to people, hey, it seems like you're upset about XYZ in a mentoring capacity, maybe because of the power difference, they'll often say like, oh no, I'm not, right? Or like, I don't have a problem with that. And then you're like, where do I go from there? So then I like to say something like, okay, well, I just want to restate, that I was giving you this feedback because I really care about your progress on this project or your progress in school. And um, I know that that feedback can be hard to hear, and I'm sorry that it might have been hard to hear. If you want to discuss it again, I would be happy to. Just like leaving the door open, right? Might be a way to let them know that you feel that something might be up, but if they're not comfortable talking about it at that moment, they can talk to you about it some other time.
So I got another question in the chat. Someone is asking, as a professor, have you noticed that your feedback style has had to kind of adapt based on your students' different generations?
I I don't know how much I believe like the generational stuff, right? So I'm a millennial, so we've just been destroyed by the media for so many years. So I just reject it. Um, I do think that COVID like did a number on all of us in terms of our sense of self and mental health in a lot of ways. And I think that what I am seeing with my students now is like, I might be teaching juniors, but they didn't go to school in person for like a year or two, right? So maybe in some ways their confidence level is more like a freshman in college would be. And just keeping that in mind has helped me to think through like me as a freshman in college and me as a junior, those were two different levels of like how many times I had talked to professors or how many times I had had real interactions in class where my classmates had assessed my ideas. So there might just be some kind of easing back into the amount of attention we give each other in person that was harder during COVID for a lot of reasons. So I try to think of it that way. I also try, it's hard, I've had four advisees now and I try not to like compare them, but I do just try to think through being aware as I continue to advise them, like this person is not the last person I advised. So they might need something different than the last person I advised, and they're all going to end up with different projects. So just being mindful of like, this person is not the person I was talking to last year about this. And this is a new chance to continue to build my ability to mentor, um, which is not to say that I get it right at all. Right? Like the other thing I think I wish students knew sometimes is just like you become a professor overnight and you're like, what? Someone let me have this job and you still feel like you're 20 and confused. So like we're all humans, right? And if you get feedback that seems harsh, maybe the professor was having a hard week or maybe they're really stressed about things. So I think that we tend to think like, oh, you're the professor, you have to have all the answers, but we are all learning from each other. And COVID has really made me think a lot about that.
That's a great point. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, it looks like we have a question in the chat. How do you overcome different cultural backgrounds and language barriers as an advisor for one or several students?
Yeah, that's a good one. Definitely not to go back to the email point too much, but following up with emails can be really helpful for folks who maybe don't speak English as a first language to have a written record of what was said. So I really just try to put everything in email. If we just had a meeting that was 30 minutes long and we agreed you're going to do three things, let's just put it in an email so that we all know what we agreed is happening. That would happen in a normal workplace, so maybe it should happen in grad school. Um, in terms of cultural backgrounds, I think that, you never want to just see someone as their cultural background or expect them to account for that as the reasons for various parts of your interaction. So I do try to just be conversational with the people I work with. Like, yeah, maybe my advisee and I were looking up Lego sets that we would like for Christmas on Wednesday as we were talking about their thesis, right? But I think that giving people that space where there's like an unplanned moment in an advising meeting where they can bring up whatever they might need to can be really helpful so that if there is something on their mind or if there's something they want you to know, they have the space to bring it up. And it's not just like, boom, 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 we're going to go through these thesis edits. Okay, bye. Have a good day. So I think that if I have like a document of like my advising style and expectations. And during the first meeting I have with students, I give that to them. And part of it is like, what do you think your work style is and what are your expectations for me? So that could open up a conversation about, cultural differences, or sometimes people tell me about aspects of their family that might play a role in how they receive feedback about things. So I just try to, if it hasn't become clear based on my like talk about it throughout this presentation, is making that document was really helpful for me because it made me spell out things about my own work style that I had never put into writing. But I also feel like more importantly, I learn a lot about students by giving them that document because that makes them think about it and they start to say, oh, this is true of me too, or oh, it might be difficult for me to do this because of X, Y, and Z reason. So I definitely think having an advising or mentoring style document to open conversations is a good thing to create if you go forward.
Thank you.
So I know you told us in relation to getting feedback to take a minute, right? Put it away, take a minute, 24 hours. But I am curious if you can just speak on experiences you've had when giving feedback and if a student gets defensive, like I don't want to say aggressive, like that's a really strong word, but when students get defensive, because like you were saying, we wrap up so much of our value in who we are and like the writing we're producing. Or the thing I hear a lot is, well, my other teachers always let me do this. Um, and like regardless if other teachers do or not, I'm just not always sure to be like to stop the conversation and maybe have them come back. Or so I'm just wondering if you can just speak on your experience of handling like that defensiveness, because go and think about it for 24 hours and come back, or just what you've done in that moment.
Yeah, I do have a 24-hour policy on if you want to dispute a grade. So I will tell students, I know you just got this grade. Can you send me an email after 24 hours after tomorrow and detail why you think this grade should be changed? And I always am very clear. I tell them the email should include why, according to the assignment guidelines and the rubric, this grade should be changed. Because I do think we get feelings attached to things, right? And the common thing I hear from students is, but I tried really hard on this. And so that's our job, right, as mentors, is to say, it's really great that you tried really hard, and that is an important aspect of success. But another important aspect is things like accuracy or attention to detail or whatever the assignment said that you didn't do, right? So I find that by asking them to assess themselves using the guidelines they were given, that does cut down on a lot of maybe the more emotion-centered reasons that people are rejecting feedback. And I do suggest a 24-hour period. If someone freaks out on me in person, which I have had happen before, I almost always find that that person had something else going on that day that was not the paper or I teach communication, the speech grade. So I do think asking them to come back can be helpful, especially as a graduate student. I would recommend if someone freaks out on you, tell them to come back another day and make sure someone else is there. Because I think that that unfortunately often plays a role in what students think they might be able to say to you. So that's basically my advice. Invite people to take a beat. If you can get them to work through it over email, that might de-escalate. And then don't be afraid to sort of think through like, who's my mentor network or who are my peers who might be here to help me with this more difficult interaction.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I really like, because I've heard of the putting like don't email for 24 hours after receiving a grade. Um, I have yet to add that to my syllabus, and I really think I should. Um, but I like the other part you have where like if you wanted to make the appointment to actually dispute it, then actually having like the rubric and saying like, so I mean, I've missed things. Students have been like, no, I wrote it, it was right here. And I was like, oh, I was grading 30 of these, I missed it. My apologies. Um, but I think having it written out and it makes them think about it too. So
Thank you both. So it looks like we don't have any other questions in the chat, but before we do end today's session, I just want to thank Dr. Rice so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And thank you to all our participants for joining us and for all the great questions. Before you all log off, if you don't mind, please taking just a few minutes to fill out this workshop feedback survey. I'm going to drop in the chat right now. This just really helps us as we continue to plan different workshops for each semester. But I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and you all have a great weekend. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.